Hello, all you book burners, and welcome to another episode of Books Are Burning. I'm Mark Will, author, songwriter, and publisher in permanent exile, currently based on the island of Taiwan. And I'm joined once again by my friend and sometime co-author, GJ Villa. How are you today, sir?
Doing well. How about yourself?
Well, I'm surviving. I'm at the end of a break here, and I've got to start work in about 8 hours.
All right.
But we don't want to talk about that. No, today we're going to talk about the reading highlights of 2024 for you. What did you read in the previous year, and what can you recommend for us, and what should we avoid? Before we start, though, I want to remind viewers and listeners that when I say Mr. Villa is my co-author, I'm talking about the Aaronesque series of novelettes. I hold in my hand before the screen here a copy of Flannsday, the first novelette in that series. And coming soon, sooner rather than later, one hopes, will be Volume 2, Wildsday. It is finished. Final edits are being completed as we speak, not as rapidly as I would hope, but that's coming soon. Stay tuned for that. You won't be sorry. All right, so it seems that this year, or this past year, 2024, you read 31 books. That's what you told me. Just like Baskin Robbins has 31 flavors, you read 31 books. Is that a typical number for you? Like, as a reading year, was 2024 a good year, a bad year, a normal year? What would you say?
Probably about average. I'd always like to read more. I read up to 40 plus, a low end might be in the 20s or something like that. But yeah, I'd say that's probably about average, between 30 and 40, somewhere around there.
And most of these books were paperbacks, or were some of them like ebooks or audiobooks?
Most probably hardcover or paperbacks, printed books. But I've read increasingly the last few years more ebooks. So the one of the books I'll talk about today, I read as an ebook. The other three as print books.
Do you? Personally, I find it very difficult to read fiction that is in the ebook format. I can do nonfiction for some reason. It's like I'm able to retain nonfiction in the ebook format, but when it's fiction, I definitely prefer paperback and hardcover. How about you?
That's generally true. Most of the fiction I'll read is in print, but and then most of the ebooks will be nonfiction. The highlightings are useful. You can take notes. You can always go back and see your highlights. That's what I'll do to refer to some of the passages from one of the books we'll be talking about. Mm-hmm. But I have read a few books this last year, more than usual, on more fictional works on ebook. If it's a work I know is going to be complex and demand a lot of attention, I will read it in print version. But recently, I hadn't read Kurt Vonnegut in over 30 years and wanted to tear through Mother Night, so I read that on ebook, and that was, that kind of reading, right? I mean, it's not necessarily light reading, but it's certainly nothing overly dense. I'll read novels like that. The Ripley book, The Talented Mr. Ripley, I read this last year. I read that on ebook. Things that are perhaps a little bit more page turning, more conventionally plot driven, right? Or the language is a little easier. So Vonnegut is wonderfully comic, satirical writer, but he's not particularly complicated, I don't think, right? You can read his books pretty quick. So, yeah, I'll read some of those on ebook, but definitely my preference is printed for works that are going to really demand my attention.
For sure. Tomek is in the house. He says, "What up, gangsters?"
All right. We'll be talking about a gangster book, right? The second of the two Viet Thanh Nguyen books, right? The Sympathizer and the Committed. The Committed is a gangster book.
Okay, well, let's get into those. Of the 31, flavors that you sampled this past year. You wanted to focus on 4 of them. So let's start with the
Sure.
fiction. Now,
Yeah.
you graciously gifted me both of these books. I've got them here. I haven't started them yet, but we've got The Sympathizer and The Committed. Volume 1 is The Sympathizer, and Volume 2 is The Committed. So you read both of these. The author is Viet Thanh Nguyen, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Sympathizer, or Pulitzer, as I've heard some people say. I grew up calling that the Pulitzer, but maybe that's
right.
my mom's Arkansas pronunciation, white trash Arkansas. She wouldn't like me saying that, but
Fortunately,
anyway,
she won't be seeing this, will she?
Probably not. Probably
you don't
not.
send your parents these.
Well,
talks?
maybe she'd be interested in knowing your reading highlights from last year. I'll have to ask.
But we'll see.
I'll have to ask. But anyway, this is the one that won the Pulitzer or Pulitzer.
Right.
So it's The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. Let's start with that. I know that there was it even says on the cover here, there's an HBO original limited series on Max. And I've not watched an entire episode, but I've seen snippets on one of the HBO channels with Robert Downey Jr. and this, I guess he's like a Vietnamese American actor as well. But otherwise, I don't know much about.
It's very good. It's great adaptation. I love the actor they found to play the divided protagonist, and Robert Downey Jr. plays 4 or 5 roles. There's a series of American characters, right? Claude, the CIA agent, the congressman, the auteur, who's modeled a little bit after Francis Ford Coppola. So he plays these different American characters who are partly caricatures and the author's way of sort of satirizing, eviscerating American sort of colonial views of Vietnam and smug sort of jingoistic American superiority and the way that manifests itself in American culture and politics of the 60s and 70s when this is taking place. So it's a brilliant book. It's a wonderful, works as satire, works as the first person narrator's rich, nuanced character. He's a bastard. His Vietnamese man who was born to a French father, a priest, right, and a Vietnamese peasant woman, right, and so he's got the Western and the sort of Eastern side in him, sort of struggling throughout the book, if you will. But I'd been meaning to read the book when it came out. I remember when it came out in 2015, I'd read lots of just accolades and put that on my to read list, and you know how things go. And a lot of times books that have big splash, I wait for a while anyway to read them, but came around and did it this summer and then tore through the sequel. The Committed was published in 2021, and I believe that he intends there to be a trilogy. The Committed, which takes place in the 80s, right? And we pick up our hero in France now rather than the United States. I guess we could start with The Sympathizer a little bit, right?
I don't know if you want to give us a synopsis of the book. I mean, you've touched upon some of it. We know who the protagonist is, son of a French priest and peasant Vietnamese woman. Where was he born? Like North, South Vietnam?
He was born in North Vietnam. Right?
Okay.
He becomes friends growing up with two. It's also a story of friendship. His 2 closest friends are Man and Bon, and they grow up ostensibly on the surface as anti-communists, but in truth, Man, his closest friend with whom he maintains contact as he's a spy in the States, Man becomes his handler. Man is actually a communist. Bon, their other friend, is a fierce anti-communist because he saw his parents killed by communists, right? So the protagonist is still in contact with Bon, with whom he flees from Vietnam while it crumbles. The whole opening chapter is this brilliant extended scene with the fall of Vietnam, basically. Our protagonist escapes with a guy named the General, an anti-communist general, and his close friend Bon, whose family gets killed on the evacuation. And so in this story of friendship, he is lying to his friend Bond, right? Pretending that he is an anti-communist,
The
Vietnam
anti-communist.
refugee in the United States, but he is meanwhile sending secret messages, coded messages to France to his so-called aunt. But these are coded messages that go back to Man, his Vietnamese handler in Vietnam. So it's a great spy story, and he is sending these coded messages, on the one hand wanting to be committed to the communist cause, but on the other hand very sympathetic to American culture and individualism and so on. And I thought I might read the opening paragraph because I think that's what captivated from the beginning. And it's an explicit nod of the head homage to Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. And you'll hear it immediately, right?
Okay.
But what captured me from the beginning of this book was the voice, right? It's also got great plot elements, right? There's a pot boiler quality. There's when he's in the States, he's working with the general and reporting back to his handler. And the general starts getting suspicious that other Vietnamese refugees and former military men like themselves might be spies. Of course, the spy is our narrator, right? So the general starts ordering some assassinations. There's all kinds of great sort of plot pot boiler, spy-like elements to it. But the voice here at the beginning, right, is just fantastic. I am a spy, a sleeper, a spook, a man of two faces. Perhaps not surprisingly, I'm also a man of two minds. I'm not some misunderstood mutant from a comic book or a horror movie, although some has treated me as such. I am simply able to see any issue from both sides. Sometimes I flatter myself that this is a talent, and although it is admittedly one of a minor nature, it is perhaps also the sole talent I possess. At other times, when I reflect on how I cannot help but observe the world in such a fashion, I wonder if what I have should even be called talent. After all, a talent is something you use, not something that uses you. The talent you cannot not use, the talent that possesses you, that is a hazard, I must confess. But in the month, when this confession begins, my way of seeing the world still seemed more of virtue than danger, which is how some dangers first appear. So, really engaging opening. We also hear that this is a confession that is being written, right? And we learn it kind of early on that he's actually writing in a Vietnamese re-education camp, right? And he's writing about all of the events that happened to him, how he was courted early on as a young, promising student in the provinces by educators, and eventually ended up in the States on a scholarship, right? Immersed himself in the American culture, came back through the CIA, who had been courting him from the beginning, right?
Yes.
Got in good with the general, the anti-communist, while maintaining links to, right, his communist brother and so on, right? And anyway, I'm not going to give away the plot events, but eventually he and his friend Bond, they make their way back to Vietnam in this aborted mission to try to, reclaim, start some skirmishes, right, on the edges of the country to reclaim the country for the anti-communists. That doesn't go well. So he's in the re-education camp, and he's forced to tell his story. So he's writing his confessions, which is the book we're reading, right?
Under duress.
Under duress, yes.
Okay.
So that's a pretty cool plot device too.
Yeah. So I guess there's always like ambiguity about what we the readers should take seriously. Like we never know what he's an unreliable narrator.
Yeah,
I
to what
guess,
degree
right?
is he? Yeah, there are some suppressed memories that come up later, and at the same time, he is not one of those willfully lying, unreliable narrators, right?
Okay.
He's trying his best to see things clearly, but his very nature, because it's divided, he never quite knows where he stands on things, right? Hence, he's the sympathizer. That's both his strength and his weakness. He can fit in. He's wearing a mask all the time. He's psychologically tortured by the fact that he doesn't know what his authentic core is. At the same time, he's absolutely brilliant. He's mastered the English language, and he delivers some incredibly funny sort of send-ups and satires of American attitudes and American culture. Yeah, that's what makes it really compelling for me, right? The fact that he is such a divided character, right? And this ability to sympathize on both sides is puts him through tremendous sort of psychological angst throughout the story.
So would you say the novel is more character driven than plot driven? Like it's
It's a
more
healthy mix
about
of both. It's certainly
okay.
character driven, right? Insofar as we are in the meshes of this character's complex psychology, and how that's impacted by history, by politics, by communism, by capitalism, by colonialism, and all those forces. But he's very aware of that. So it's a kind of intellectual meta awareness of these forces that are acting on him, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's a great blend of there are some definite plot driven, spy genre elements that keep you turning the pages, and then there's just some absolutely um, brilliant moments of analysis. And the analysis
Yeah.
works because it's within the scope of from the perspective of this divided consciousness.
Well, you mentioned Ellison, and when you said that the book was kind of an homage to someone or something, I thought you might mention this one, Graham Greene's The Quiet American,
Let me
which
interject real fast before you go on. When
mm,
our narrator was in the States in the early 60s in California, getting a
mm-hmm,
master's in American culture, right, before he goes back to Vietnam and so on and so forth. And he's
mm-hmm,
there with the blessings of the CIA. Um, and one of the professors there is the professor, right? Is one of he has a series of American mentors, a CIA agent, an academic guy, the congressman, the auteur. But the professor, he writes our protagonist writes his master's thesis on Quiet American.
of course,
Of
yeah,
course, right? Of
yeah.
course.
Okay, well, that was a highlight for me. I don't know if you've read it. I think you told me you hadn't. The Quiet American, have you?
No, but I saw the movie years ago, which I liked a lot, and I've read other Graham Greene, and I've enjoyed it. The End of the Affair,
Yeah,
some other books.
it was a highlight for me. I don't think it was last year, but 2023 maybe. Yeah, knowing that there's a connection to that will, you know, encourage me to start reading this sooner rather than
Yeah,
later.
I mean, I found it compulsive. Let me just give you a. Here is one bit of hilarious, I think, satire, and he's talking. Let me see if I can set the context for this. Um, he's talking about American sort of Vietnamese prostitution, right? Catering to American servicemen and so on. And he says, "Now I am daring to accuse American strategic planners of deliberately eradicating peasant villages in order to smoke out the girls who would have little choice but to sexually service the same boys who bombed, shelled, strafed, torched, pillaged, or merely forcibly evacuated said villages. Is that what I am doing? I'm merely noting that the creation of native prostitutes to service foreign privates is an inevitable outcome of a war of occupation, one of those nasty little side effects of defending freedom that all the wives, sisters, girlfriends, mothers, pastors, and politicians in Smallville, USA, pretend to ignore behind waxed and buffed walls of teeth as they welcome their soldiers home, ready to treat any unmentionable afflictions with a penicillin of American goodness." So there's lots of
And a yellow ribbon.
and a yellow ribbon. There's lots of passages about that. I'll just point out one more when he's critiquing the film The Hamlet, written by this auteur, this famous auteur, and it was not. This is inspired by Apocalypse Now, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
our author has said it's a masterpiece of a film, and it still basically represents us in shit ways, right? But on
Wait, it still
it
represents
represents
what?
us, the Vietnamese, from an American perspective in a shitty way, right? We're
Yes,
just there as
right.
cannon fodder, right?
Yeah.
So on and so forth, right? But on, let's see if I can see this. Uh, he is at one point with his connection to politicians in the CIA asked to be a authenticity specialist on this film called The Hamlet, which is about a Green Beret who has to save a Vietnamese hamlet, but of course, saving it first, he has to eradicate the communists and so on, right?
Mm,
And you get lines like this: "I had failed, and the auteur would make the hamlet as he intended, with my countrymen serving merely as raw material for an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people."
mm,
And there's an extended whole scene where he's on set. There's just some incredibly comic moments, which are complemented by this trenchant uh, um, political satire. So Yeah, a fantastic book through and through. Right.
Okay, so that's the
That's the
Sympathizer.
Sympathizer. That's the Sympathizer. The next
And then in
installment
volume two,
in volume 2, The Committed, which was in 2021, right?
mm-hmm.
The Without giving too much away, at the end of the Sympathizer, the narrator, as well as his childhood friend Bon, who still doesn't know that the narrator is a double agent and has been today, they manage to escape Vietnam. They're boat people, and they
Wait,
end up.
does the other friend know he's a double agent?
Yeah, the other friend is actually. Again, I'm trying to struggle. How much should I give away? How much should I not? His other friend Man, yeah, knows that he is a double. That's his
Okay.
contact back in Vietnam, right? And in
Okay.
fact, he shows up at the end of the narrative in the Vietnamese re-education camp.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, at the end of the book, he and Bon, his other friend, they escape Vietnam. And they end up in France in the late 70s, early 80s, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in some ways, even though the Sympathizer might be a stronger literary work, I think the Committed in some ways is more fun. There we are introduced. He ends up in France, right, which is apt, right, because of course the French colonizing of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
He and Bon get connected to the Vietnamese French community, and he starts working for a guy named the Boss. The Boss is an unnamed character like our narrator. And at this point, our narrator is a little bit insane, right? They call him the Madman. That becomes his nickname. But the Boss is a Vietnamese, a Chinese immigrant, right, of Vietnamese background, right? And he has basically set himself up as a gangster in France in the 80s, right? He's got
Okay.
a bunch of people under him. One of them is called the Cowboy, Lecaoboi, right? The Cowboy, right?
Right.
Who was described on page 27. Great description. Let's see if I can find this, right? Ooh, wrong book here. Let me pull this up real fast. Yeah. Next to the register, a stereo played the cassettes of high-pitched Chinese and Vietnamese opera. Behind the register was the maitre d' and musical curator Le Cowboy, who, from looks to manners, was the typical romantic Vietnamese man, part poet, part playboy, and part gangster. He was the boss's field marshal. He introduced the restaurant's employees, 2 waiters, 3 chefs, the busboy, and the janitor, or as the Cowboy called them, the 7 dwarfs. So it's hilarious. The cowboy wears these aviation sunglasses, and they get into drug dealing. And whereas in the first book, in the Sympathizer, he is still trying to hold fast to his communist ideals while also being aware of the flaws of communism and the difference between theory and practice and the allure of American individualism and all these things he's struggling with. In this one, he goes full capitalist. And what is more
Mm.
capitalistic than drug dealing, right? So
Mm.
he's on the streets dealing dope to uh,
Smack.
mostly marijuana, but some other stuff. But he's dealing to some French intellectuals. Most of them are left-wing intellectuals, right? There's a great character called the Maoist PhD that gets
Mm-hmm.
more opportunity for more satire. So he's satirizing everything, right? And then there's some encounters with Algerian gangs, and that gives rise to a lot of great passages and interludes where the narrator is talking about those the colonized peoples, the
Yeah,
Vietnamese
of
and the
course.
Algerians now in
Right.
France, in the motherland, so to speak, warring against each other to try to corner these drug trades.
Mm-hmm.
It is a fantastically entertaining book from start to finish, and so um, I think he's intending on writing a trilogy. I'll be curious to see what happens in the next installment. But you've got the
What do you
books.
know? Yeah, I've got
And
to
yeah,
get
definitely think you'll
started on
find them
them.
compulsively readable. So definitely a couple
Hmm.
of my highlights from last year. These are fantastic.
What can you tell us briefly about the author?
Born in
Isn't he?
Vietnam, but came
Yeah.
to the States early as a boat person, right? Ended up in California, right? So
Mm-hmm.
he sort of divided in some ways, like his narrator, right? But he is an American citizen now. I've listened to interviews with him. He's absolutely brilliant, right? And at the end of the Sympathizer, there are a couple of pieces by him that I think when you finish the book, you'll really enjoy. Where he talks about his inspiration, where he talks about his background. Let me see if I can find maybe just one little bit here at the end.
Cannon fodder? Is that what you're talking
Yeah,
about?
cannon fodder and so on. He also I really like the way in which he wanted to write from a minority perspective, but he did not want to write a standard minority novel where the intended audience is basically a white audience and you're trying to prove the humanity of your minority character.
Yeah.
And he's like, that can oftentimes lead to simplistic characters. I wanted a complex character. Um, while I wanted to eviscerate the American occupation of Vietnam, I also wanted to show Vietnamese culpability as well, right, on both the anti-communist and communist side. So essentially, another thing I really appreciate is his shout out for complexity rather than simplistic, oppressor, oppressee, those boring binaries, right, that can too often occur in some works by so-called minority uh, minority writers. At one point here, he says, rather than writing a book that tries to affirm humanity, which is typically the position that minority writers are put into, the book starts from the assumption that we are human and then goes on to prove that we're also inhuman at the same time. I mean, the narrator finds himself doing some political hits and some morally repugnant things, right? So he's by no means this. It's not always easy to sympathize with him, but you do end up sympathizing with him because he is such a savage critic of himself, right? And because of his kind of amorphous, divided nature. So fantastic all around. Highly recommended.
Two thumbs up, huh?
2 thumbs up. Yeah. And I read him last summer when I was really I wanted some page turning, provocative stuff, and I'm like, all right, it's time to read The Sympathizer, and it lived up to my expectations, and I immediately put it down and got the sequel, which I also loved, and passed them along to my son, who read both of them and really enjoyed them too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, I better get cracking.
All
Tomek
right.
says complexity, baby, and he also says Brighton Rock, stand up.
Brighton
Another
Rock. All right. We have
Graham
one audience
Greene
member at
shout
least
out.
then, right?
Oh yeah.
Hello, Tomek.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I've enjoyed some texting, and I actually enjoyed most of your recent chat with Steve the Idiot. He's a pretty charismatic guy.
Oh, on the Enneagram. Okay.
That's right. Well, what Steve read, I'm actually haven't finished that because y'all didn't even get to talking about the books until like after an hour or more.
Oh, well, we never did cover the 9 personality types. We were all
right.
over the place.
I'm at the moment now where y'all are about to talk about the mysticism book, which I'm going to read here probably in the next couple of months.
Okay.
That one looks really fascinating. Anyway.
Well, Steve might be watching now, too. I don't know. He said
hello,
he might.
Steve, and Tomek as well. Hope we all meet one day, at least virtually, perhaps.
Yeah, Tomek says, hope to meet you in person sometime. Yeah, maybe you can join us on texting or a books are burning episode or even guitar and pen. We'll see. But all right, that concludes the fiction section of our discussion. Let's move on to nonfiction.
Let's do it.
You're going to have to sell these books to me. I think I might be less interested, but maybe you'll surprise me.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll surprise me.
Amya Srinivasan's The Right to Sex is a series of essays from a brilliant young philosopher and feminist.
Well, I support the right to sex, so...
this is from 2021. They are just absolutely scintillating. The preface, she's a incredibly cogent, nuanced writer. In the preface, she sort of talks about what the following essays will be doing, right? She starts off by asserting that feminism is not a philosophy or a theory or even a point of view. It's a political movement to transform the world beyond recognition. So she talks about just when you look upon the history of most societies, not all, of course, being resolutely patriarchal in nature, what is a future world of equality between the sexes and genders look like, and so on. So she begins with that. She asserts also, with all the assigned and implicit social meanings already attached to it, sex is itself already gender in disguise, right? Nothing revolutionary there, right? Judith Butler's talked about that before as well. But what she's interested in these essays, she wants to examine, she says, the ethics of sex beyond the narrow parameters of consent, to look at what forces lie behind a woman's yes. So it's, among other things, an examination of sex positivity, right? But if sex positivity is just looking at consent as that which closes the conversation, what leads to consenting to different things? And then finally, She states that in these essays, I attempt to dwell where necessary in discomfort and ambivalence. These essays do not offer a home, but I hope they do offer for some a place of recognition. So, when I hear someone who is talking about nuance and complexity, I'm always attuned. She's not a simplistic polemical writer. She's a philosopher. She knows the history of feminism and all its various schools, and she's looking at a series of contemporary issues, right, about that relate to women, to men, to the relationship between the sexes, so on and so forth.
She's an academic.
She's an
She's
academic.
American.
No, I think she is of Indian background. She's in Oxford, I believe.
Okay.
I'll give you an example of the complexity she's talking about. The first essay is called "The Conspiracy Against Men," right? And it's given rise to like this idea that the Me Too movement led to some excessive backlash, and men have been victimized by this, and she's pushing back against that, right? So she begins that essay saying that there's not a conspiracy against men, but there is a conspiracy against certain classes of men. So, for instance, poor black men. A black man serving for sexual assault is 3.5 times more likely to be innocent than a white man convicted of sexual assault. He's also very likely to be poor. So she's thinking about what does conspiracy against men really look. She's looking at both the intersection of feminism and racism and so on, structural inequalities. And I'll say a couple more things and see if you have any questions. She says later in the essay, when she's talking about the slogan "Believe Women" that came up in Me Too, and there's people, believe women? You mean we're supposed to just completely believe anything they say, right? What about innocent until proven guilty? And her response is that it's a category error to think that believe women is a legal principle. She says it's a political response to what we suspect will be its uneven application. And then she talks about how the norms of the law, the presumption of innocence on a legal principle, do not set the norms of rational belief. That is, right, if over 100 women accused Weinstein of assault and harassment, it's rational to believe he's probably guilty, right? When you learn of those allegations, right? And that the outcome of a trial does not determine what we should believe. For instance, O.J. Simpson, right? So on the one hand, she's critiquing, those who push back against that believe women and say they don't understand what it really is. It's not a legal principle, right? But then she'll follow something like that with this. She'll say, like, at the same time, believe women is a blunt tool of zero-sum logic. Consider that, and here she says, only 4.2% of the student body at Colgate was Black during the 13-14 academic year, and yet 50% of the accusations of sexual violation that year were against Black students. Does believe women serve justice as Colgate, right? So that's a great example of what I love about these essays, that she is looking at things from all sides, right? On the one hand, pushing back against those who would like dismiss the notion of believe women, while also saying, hey, it can also be a blunt tool when we look at these statistics, right? And when we look at the men accused, right? How is it that men of color are much more heavily accused than white men?
Functionality.
Yes.
I heard that phrase as "believe all women." Is it believe women or believe all women? Because there seems to be a slight difference there, right?
Yeah. I mean, the phrase that was popularized was "believe women," right? Believe us. And again, I understand why that came about. Women usually historically have not been believed, right? Anyhow, so that's the opening, right? And I can just sort of, the opening piece is about that, right? And let me sort of jump around, right? She looks at stuff like, the next essay is called "Talking to My Students About Porn." And this is a fantastic essay where she gives a good survey of feminism in the 70s and 80s and the clashes between different kinds of feminists. She knows all of the feminist schools, right? Political feminism, socialism-infused feminism, anti-porn feminism. In this essay, she's talking about the conflict in the 80s between the sex-positive feminists and the anti-porn feminists. But then she's thinking about pornography in the age of ubiquitous porn and the conversations she has with her very bright students in their 20s who have grown up as the first generation completely immersed in pornography with instant availability. I mean, remember when we were growing up, it was the Sears catalog if we needed some masturbatory fodder, or if we were lucky, to have a parent who was a little perverted like I did. You did not, of course, you did Christian parents. Sneak in and find the penthouse in the Hustler. That was a gold mine, right? Or going to the gas station and trying to get one of those dirty magazines it was so hard for us. We had to work for our porn. And now we have this generation that.
And a video was like impossible to obtain.
That was impossible until, one of your friends had cable, and then you were suddenly able to watch the Playboy channel, and you were like, what is happening here? But now she's thinking about the way in which, her students have completely grown up on porn, and how many of them, progressive liberals, are critical of women especially, but also men, of sex positivity and pornography in general, right? I'll read a couple of passages here to just give you some of a taste of her prose here. She says at one point, porn does not inform or persuade or debate. Porn trains. It etches deep grooves in the psyche, forming powerful associations between arousal and selected stimuli, bypassing the part of us which pauses, considers, thinks. Associations strengthen through repetition, reinforced and reproduced, reducing the social meaning assigned by patriarchy to sexual difference. So it's this interesting that many of her students are on board with the critiques of the anti-porn feminists from the 80s, right? In terms of the way in which that she looks at porn as like a speech act, right? Which she borrows from Catherine McKinnon, right? That porn doesn't just depict, but actually enacts female subordination, right? Makes it, just as like a murder speech act, when a hitman says, go murder someone, that is a speech act, right? Or wedding vow, speech act theory. So her students largely agree with that, right? Interestingly enough. But the nuanced writer that she is, she also then looks at the complications of trying to legislate pornography and why those attempts to legislate pornography so often fail, right? In fact, they often fail because they do worse for the very women they're purporting to save, right? Sex workers, right? The more that sex work is legislated against or made illegal, right, the more dangerous their work is, and so on, right? So she's not offering solutions. She's offering complex diagnoses, right, of all of these issues. She looks at, in the title essay, The Right to Sex, she looks at incel culture, right, and examines how that and where that male entitlement comes from. Interestingly, I didn't know this, but the origin of incel was in the, I think the early 90s. Alana, a nerdy queer woman, right, who initially made the phrase up, she was an involuntary celibate, and she was just looking for connection and wondering if there are other people like her. And that was a term seized upon by the manosphere and has been completely appropriated and now means something different altogether, right?
Just so like Me Too.
Yeah, exactly. She's got another one on not sleeping with your students, right? With the rise of consensual relationship policies at the American universities. Apparently in 1989, there were only 17% of American universities that had those that would bar consensual relationship policies between professor and students. In 2014, that's up to 84%. So she's examining those kinds of things. Brilliant essays, absolutely scintillating. I couldn't put them down. It was one of those rare books also where, in addition to underlining and annotating, I went back and for each essay I took scrupulous notes in my journal. I was just really compelled to wanted to soak it all in.
How did you get turned on to this text? Was it something you were planning to share with students, or
no?
Where did you hear about it?
No, I don't know if I want to talk about pornography with high school students per se, right? Maybe for teaching. No, I just read about I'd read about her, right? And then this collection came out and it was lauded. I do what I always do. I put it on my wish list, right? So I've got this, as you do, I'm sure, this endless wish list of books, and just decided, we've talked about our different reading styles. You're very much a completionist. You go through. I'm kind of like a dilettante. I'll jump from thing to thing, and so I just went back and it's like, okay, I want to read that now, right? Bought it, and I'm very glad that I did.
So your 31 books this year, we may get into this a bit later, but would you say it was like balanced between fiction and nonfiction, or did you?
Probably a little bit more heavy on the fiction side. I might read 2/3 fiction, 1/3 nonfiction.
I see.
Sometimes half and half, depending. I don't know. I'd have to look at my list again.
But,
I do a steady dose of nonfiction, and I probably do a little bit more fiction, depending.
Okay. We've got some more comments in the chat. The idiot says, Via looks amazing in purple. Very few do. Prince and Via
All right.
enjoying this.
Thank you.
Tomek says, Victoria's Secret, brah. Yeah, the idiot says I should try to say something more eloquent. Well, I don't know if that's going to
The
happen.
idiot is very eloquent, right? I'm very much enjoyed the. I'm almost done with the extended talk about what Steve read, so that's been entertaining.
You okay?
I've read.
I thought
I'm right at the point where you're about to talk about the mysticism book, which is already on my list, in which I'm going to finish one more book that I'm in the middle of, and probably get that. That's going to jump to the top of my list. That looks absolutely fascinating.
I just ordered it yesterday, so it's on its
Fantastic.
way to Taiwan.
Maybe we should all do a powwow on that one after we've all read it. Perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because that kind of aligns. We have a sort of side project which is not as systematic as it should be, at least on my part, right? To reread. I'm rereading the Gospels, the King James Gospels, and then there's some other books on Christianity we're both interested in.
Well, the idiot is also reading The Idiot by Dostoevsky.
Oh, okay.
I ordered that as well.
Prince
so
Mishkin.
Yeah, I know you've read that couple
Ages
of times,
ago.
right?
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe we can have a chat about that too. Let me see another comment. You guys are making my cold and miserable walk through the rain on a Sunday afternoon about 150,000% better than it was when I first started. Okay.
All right.
Glad to hear that.
Okay.
I think I read the collection as well. This is the Right to Sex book, I guess. There seems to be so little good writing out there on porn. It's so key to our cultural and sexual worlds, but no one seems interested in writing about it. Why? And Tomek says,
is just absolutely fantastic too, and in the way that she puts this in the context of various, feminist debates that are still going on in a lot of ways, right? But she puts those within their historical context, right? And it makes it contemporary by talking about the way in which her own students, again, these are not fundamentalist kids, these are progressive kids who've grown up in the culture of sex positivity, and so she's talking about the limits of that or the way in which that can lead to unfulfillment, right?
Yeah.
In the context of pornography culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
That becomes the metric for what sex is, right? How sex is represented. And you pair that with, at least in the States, certainly, absolutely abysmal, non-existent, at least non-effective sex education in the public schools. I mean, it's a recipe for fucking disaster.
Tomek corrected me. He says he, meaning Steve, the idiot, means he will try to say something more eloquent. I gotcha. Saw Will and thought that was directed to Mark Will. It's difficult to multitask. I'm trying to
You're doing
engage
great.
in the
host.
In the chat and also not ignore our wonderful guests in the chat. So, okay, let's move on to the second nonfiction selection. It is Dame Judy Butler's Who's Afraid of Gender? Of course, when I hear that title, I think of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Right. Is it a play on that?
I think so. I think that's part of it, right?
Yeah.
The answer
I ain't afraid, Judy.
The answer is globally everybody's afraid, and everybody is demonizing gender, particularly trans folks. So it's definitely it was published last year. You've probably read some elements of her performative gender theory that made her name in the 90s and 2000s and so on. And her
gender
writing
is drag, isn't that what she said?
Exactly. And as provocative as those ideas were and are and relevant, she's also been rightly criticized for her dense, obfuscating prose. I forget what the award is for, like the most laughably bad sort of academic prose, but she's won that before and so on, right?
Yep.
This book is not like that. This book is this impassioned political plea, ultimately, for self-determination and a criticism of the way in which gender is being levied, by the Vatican, in the United States, in Hungary, in Russia, throughout the world, right, as this phantasm, this boogeyman that embodies all of these legitimate fears that people have about the world and foists them onto this thing called gender, right? So it's that's the essence, I think, of the argument. It starts, gender is a kind of phantasm with wild destructive powers, right? And that the goal of invoking gender as this destructive force is to induce moral panics, and it's what authoritarian regimes do, right? So it's a critique of the way in which authoritarian regimes and impulses in the United States and internationally are using and creating this phantasm, right? So she lists out the different contradictory ways that gender is used to fabricate this phantom, right? The idea that it is, for example, the Vatican stating that it is, a case of toxic moral relativism that goes against God's plan, and it's out to destroy the traditional family. It's going to abolish the categories of mother and father. It's going to engender a, atheistic, genderless future. It's a threat to the nation state. It is child abuse, right? Insofar as it grooms children into these toxic sort of ideologies. And there's contradictions in Hall. On the one hand, there's a critique that it's unbridled consumerist individuality. You can be whatever you want to be, right? And that goes against nature and against biology and against God's plan. But at the same time, there's a critique that it is a form of indoctrination and grooming, right? It's going to obliterate your children's individuality. So on the one hand, children should not be so free. On the other hand, children, should not
be
should
limited,
not have their freedom taken from them, and so on. So what she establishes early on is that these contradictions are deliberate. That's the whole point, right? People have these legitimate fears in the global moment we're at. Think about climate destruction, vast income inequality, the
threat of nuclear annihilation.
Right. The way the legacy that we're still living in of neoliberalism and so on. And so people are having all kinds of social and economic anxieties. So politicians use this thing called gender as a way to embody those fears. And the point is those contradictions are essential, right? Because gender becomes this pliable thing that can be used to stoke any number of fears from any number of constituencies, right?
Yeah,
whether
it's
you are
a
socioeconomically struggling,
a
whether you're
wedge
religious
issue.
Exactly. So
it's just a culture war talking point on both sides.
It is, right? And when you think that trans people make up approximately 1% of the world's population, of course, this is straight out of the fascist playbook to demonize those who are the most powerless, right? And for me, it's certainly personal because many of my friends are in the E&M, poly, kink worlds and so on, right? And they have all kinds of different sorts of relationships, and some are trans, gender fluid, et cetera, et cetera. And so and I don't mean to sound like one of those, I have lots of trans friends. That's not what I'm saying, right? It's just that I just,
some of your best friends are trans.
My best friend, right. But it's our friend, we have a very close friend whose son is trans, knew he was trans when he was 3 years old, right? Thank God he was raised by parents who embraced that and empowered him and so on, right? So it's a really timely, compulsively readable bit of nonfiction. It's urgent, right? And her writing is honed and focused in a way that her theoretical writings sometimes are not.
Okay.
So that's my pitch. I'll give you a quote here.
Obscurantism. Right? Yeah. Is that the right word? Yeah.
She says at one point, I oppose the sexological projects that seek to coerce bodies into conforming within dimorphic ideals. In contrast, I hope to show how various scientific paradigms offer a way to think about gender as a spectrum or a mosaic, a living complexity worthy of affirmation. Ultimately, this becomes a plea for self-determination, right? That people have the freedom to define themselves as they will, right? And that this is an attack on that individual freedom, right, for self-definition and so on. So it's very much a humane and humanistic work, right? And she does, there's a chapter on the influence of the Vatican. There's a chapter on Trump's leveraging of it. There's a chapter on what's happening in Russia and Hungary and some authoritarian places. There's a chapter in which she debates the the what are the TERFs, the trans exclusionary radical feminists, who are aligning themselves with authoritarians, right? So she pushes back against the idea that sex assigned at birth is something that's immutable. That the category of woman, she says, has been debated historically in societies from the beginning of time, right? So anyway, fantastic reading, right? I hard to put down and incredibly timely and urgent.
Tomek asks, "What's happening in Russia?"
Well,
of course, that's where he's based.
Well, I think Putin's stance towards the LGBTQ community speaks for itself.
He says, "Not that I disagree."
I mean, I don't presume to know more than Tomek, who lives there, but everything I've read in terms of the way he's driven the LGBT folks, right, to the margins, right, and enacted laws and policies against them, right. He's made claims that they threaten the sovereignty of the nation, right. They go against the traditional family, against traditional Russian sort of identity, and so on. Hey, can we pause for a second? I need help with something real fast. I will be.
Yeah, we'll just let it roll.
All right, this will just take a couple seconds. Okay.
I'll talk to the chat. So, Tomek, anything you want to say in response to that? I'm already thinking about the friends we made in Vladivostok when we were there. Not that I agree with Via. I mean, yeah, I understand, but he's also saying it's possibly more complex. Again, complexity, baby. So, I mean, is there anything you would push back on, or like, can you provide some nuance to that categorization of Putin's views, or is there nothing further to say? Feel free to answer in the chat. Not really. I mean, I can't condone Russia's official position. Right. But how much of it is just rhetoric? Not that rhetoric can't be dangerous as well, but how much of it is just, like the equivalent of an American wedge issue or conservative talking point? Well, I would just say that the West seems to weaponize LGBT a bit too much. Yes, I agree.
Wrapping up here soon.
Yeah.
All right, I'm back.
So just so you know, Tomek responded in the chat. He says he agrees with you basically, and he can't condone Russia's official position. However, he would just say that the West seems to weaponize LGBT a bit too much. In other words, the West, meaning NATO, America, and so on, they don't give a shit about LGBTQ people or trans people. It's just like what they do with human rights in China, right? It's just a way to attack their...
Well, they do that also in Africa, and actually Judith Butler writes about that too. So she agrees with Tomek, and I agree with Tomek, right? Both things are true at once.
Right.
That Russia is deplorable when it comes to its marginalization and attack on this minority, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of these world agencies,
the US,
yes.
Yeah, they're not the good guys.
No, I mean, also
the theme seems to be developing here. Complexity, baby. Maybe that's what we'll call this episode. Sure.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the nonfiction. Anything more you want to say about those two selections?
Other than that, I think they are fantastic reads, and anyone interested in these kinds of contemporary issues about sexual politics and gender and so on should read them.
Okay. Well, we're doing pretty good in terms of time. Let's just move to the lightning round. There were several other books on your list of 31 Baskin-Robbins flavors that I wanted to ask about. So just whatever you want to say. I mean, you can give it thumbs up, thumbs down, give a brief synopsis, whatever you want to say or not say.
The powers of my memory are, how books are. You read so much and you retain some more than others, but I'll certainly be able to give my impressions.
Yeah. 100 Boyfriends.
Good. Raunchy, pornographic. Seems like the writer is also like he's clearly writing from his own sort of experience.
This is a gay black author.
Yeah, yeah.
Who
They're
identifies
hilarious at
as such.
times. They're
I'm not
unapologetic.
mislabeling him. He calls himself
Oh
a
yeah,
gay
he's a
black
gay. He's
writer.
a black writer, right?
Right.
And and a lot of these are about various hookups with different
Hookups,
so
yeah.
so-called boyfriends. Some are
Yeah.
squalid, some are hilarious, some are like borderline tragic, right? But a good read for sure. So I would thumbs up that, I suppose, right?
Mm. Tomek added another comment, but also many Russian people are just more private about their sexuality and prefer it that way. Don't ask, don't tell, basically. Not that I agree that it should be that way, though, either. I mean, I definitely appreciate outspokenness, but,
I hear
there
you,
are
and
some cultural sensitivities,
there are
it's
some
like,
cultural sensitivities, I would assume, and he knows more than I do about that. But there's a difference between living in a place where you have the luxury of choosing to be private about it, where you
mm.
don't have, versus you don't have the luxury of being, you have to be private about it, right?
Yeah, well, I would just say, I mean, I'm sure Tomek has a wide circle of friends now, but when we were talking about this, I was talking to myself to the screen about this when you went to check on the cat or whatever. But when we were in Vladivostok, the three people we became friendly with for that week or whatever, two of them were members of the gay community, and they were strong, Putin supporters and like Russian nationalists, and they had like a really strong sense of Russian identity. So there is
Well, I would
some
love to talk to them about that. I just
complexity
wonder how
there.
open they can be about being part of that community, and if they can express affection in public, and if they have the same legal rights as their heterosexual counterparts. It'd be fascinating to talk to them about that,
Mm,
just as it would be fascinating to talk to gay people who supported Trump.
mm. Yeah, Steve says he would love to see the full list at some point. If you agree, I can share it in
Oh,
the show
sure,
notes.
sure.
But
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so moving along in our lightning round, The Glass Castle.
Yeah. I mean, that's a book I taught. Right. It's a good memoir. About um, uh, what is the author's name again? Do you have that written down? Let me see here. Jeanette
No.
Walls. Jeanette Walls' sort of famous memoir of growing up with growing up poor and having a kind of itinerant lifestyle with two kind of adventurous but irresponsible parents. They end up in Appalachia near the end, which is where her father's from, and so it's also about Appalachia and so on.
So
But
one
it's
should read it with hillbilly elegy. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know if I'd go that far, right? I've read both of those, but
And you liked it, right?
I liked it okay, yeah, at the time. But see, that was during the Obama era, where this cunning snake, J.D. Vance, was trying to position himself as um, one of the rational conservatives in the era of Obama, and actually spoke of Obama as a kind of inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
He's just
He
a
probably
complete.
wouldn't do that now, would he?
He probably would not. No, no.
Tomek says Tim Dillon, gay for Trump. That's true.
Yeah.
Tim Dillon, the comedian. All right. I and you. I know we're going fast, but
That's okay. It's a short play, a couple high school characters. I was sampling a book for a class, right? I'm not sure I would necessarily recommend it,
mm-hmm.
But it's all right.
Okay.
So I don't know.
In the time of the butterflies.
Yeah, that was one I had to reread. I included books on there that I had to reread. That's another book that I teach, right?
Okay.
Which is fine. It's about the Mirabal sisters who defied the Trujillo dictatorship, right?
In where would that be?
Dominican Republic.
Trujillo. Didn't Vargas Llosa
Yeah, Vargas
write?
Llosa, the Feast of the Goat.
Feast of the Goat. Yes. Okay.
That
okay.
is a 5-star.
Yeah, much better than In the Time of the Butterflies, I'm assuming.
Yeah. I think so.
I read that. Yeah. All
that
right.
is fantastic.
So the talented Mr. Ripley, I encouraged you to read that, and I think
glad I did.
Very much enjoyed it. We should maybe have a chat about that at some point and read more. I want to read the entire Ripley.
Yeah, there's like 4 other books with Ripley in it. Yeah, I like the third person, right? Sometimes that kind of close third person, right, which gives the narrative voice a little distance from the fascinating monster, while also hewing close to him. But yeah, I rewatched the movie, which
The
is beautiful.
Netflix series, or
The movie. But then I saw the Netflix series.
The Matt Damon movie.
Yeah, which
Right.
is to me that's a beautiful movie, right? Anthony Minghella, I think his name is, whatever. But that seems to depict Ripley more as a sociopath rather than a psychopath. He burns hot, he's passionate, etc. I found that the miniseries that was recently released is closer to the book in terms of plot, and also to the character of our anti-hero. Is very cold, much more psychopathic than sociopathic.
Yeah.
I think. The movie's great in its own right, you know. Did you see the Netflix series?
Yeah, I told you about it. Yeah.
Right.
With Sting's child in the role
fantastic
of Freddy.
Right.
You mean they?
They, yes.
How dare you? Baumgartner, that is Paul Auster, is it not?
Yes, it is. Good. I mean, I read that because Auster died this year, and I had been a huge fan of Auster in the 90s and the aughts. And in fact, I just taught City of Glass in an urban fictions class, which is the first in the New York trilogy. So that, I think, was his final book, right? About an academic who loses his wife, right? Beautiful story, right? A lot of Auster's hallmarks, you know, the role of chance, right? The way in which identity transforms over time. And it's also just a very humanistic, moving meditation on loss, right?
So it's a yay rather than a nay.
It's a yay, yeah.
Okay.
It's not one of his best, but it's all Paul. I don't know. I'm not sure how much Auster you've read, but his books, even when you don't like them, they are page turners, right? While being kind of intellectual and engaging.
Yeah, I think I read City of Glass on your recommendation long ago.
Yeah,
but I haven't read as much of his work as you have. So maybe we'll put that on the list. Interior Chinatown.
If you're going to do Auster, I would recommend other books rather than Baumgartner.
Okay.
So if you're going to actually do something by him, let me know, and I can, like, Leviathan.
Okay.
Moon Palace. Those are wonderful novels.
Okay. Interior Chinatown.
Yeah, good kind of satire of Asian representation in the media. I think that was recently made into a Hulu's miniseries, which I haven't seen.
Okay.
It was entertaining. I'd give it a thumbs up. You know, it's not great, but it was good.
Okay. Signs preceding the end of the world. I'm trying to remember what that was.
Yes, I'd recommend that to everybody. You can read that in a sitting. It's just under 100 pages, pretty large font, and it's Makina, our protagonist, is crossing the border from Mexico into the United States in search of her brother who's disappeared in New Mexico. And the story takes on a kind of heroic journey, mythic scope, right? So
this is not the hurricane season author,
that's
is it?
Fernanda Melchor. That is
okay.
You know, if we were talking about best books I've read in the last 5 years, yeah, the Hurricanes. You read Hurricane Season?
Yeah. Along with La Batute.
La Batute, we did a podcast on.
We did several. Yeah, very in depth. That is a canonical book for sure.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Harlem
a new
Shuffle,
one, by the way, right? That we need to read at some point.
La Batute.
Yeah,
La Batute.
Yeah,
I'd be down for that.
Which he wrote in English.
Oh wow!
Right.
Okay.
He's he's bilingual, right? And the book is The Maniac.
Show notes.
Let me read you a quick synopsis, right? It's centered on the Hungarian polymath John von Neumann, tracing the impact of his singular legacy on the dreams and nightmares of the 20th century in the nascent age of AI. It's about prodigy, obviously this intellectual prodigy, right? Who basically, as it says here, transforms every field he touched, inventing game theory and the first programmable computer, and pioneering AI, digital life, and cellular automata. So yes, we should read that soon. And got accolades, and it sounds like it may be just as good as, you know, When We Cease to Understand the World.
That's a high bar.
It is a high bar. Yeah.
Okay. Harlem Shuffle.
Fantastic. Love it.
Okay.
Yes.
It sounded good.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good.
This is tell us about that.
Harlem Shuffle is about Ray Carney, someone who's trying to go straight in a criminal world. His dad was a criminal in Harlem, and he is trying to be a furniture salesman, but he's working as a fence. So he has connections to the criminal world, and he helps to sell contraband material that flows through him, right? And it's in 3 different sections. We go from the late 50s to the mid 60s, and we get an incredibly vibrant portrayal of Harlem of the era, including some of the race riots, some of the politics, the culture, etc. This is also a trilogy. He wrote that in 2021, I think it was. And I am in the middle of the second book, which picks up with the same character in the 1970s Harlem, Crook Manifesto. And there's going to be a third installment, I think, that goes through the 80s. So it's also kind of social.
Crip Manifesto. Crip.
No, Crook.
Crook. Oh, okay.
Crook, not Crip. Crook Manifesto, right?
Crook Manifesto. That's a better
title. It is fantastic.
title.
Harlem Shuffle is compulsively readable. It's sometimes it reads a little like genre fiction. There's a heist in part 1. There's the criminal underworld. There's it's about the classic American story of remaking yourself as an individual and rising beyond the past, right? And becoming respectable. He's got a young family, and excellent stuff.
Okay, I'll put that on the list. Both Sides, Stories from the Border. This is nonfiction, yes?
No, those are fictional stories. Some of those are good. Some of them are okay, right? It's just a compilation of interesting stories from the border about the violence on the border. A couple of those pieces are sort of horror stories, which take from the sort of horror genre and even sci-fi genre.
Okay.
It's a mixed bag. Right. I was doing that as research for an urban fictions class.
Okay. The Other Americans.
It's okay. I don't know. I'm not sure I'd really recommend that one. That's for a class as well. It's pretty multiple narrators. Okay. I wouldn't recommend.
Okay. That's a thumbs down, people. The Great War and Modern Memory. That's an old classic, isn't it?
That is an old classic, which I had read the first chapter and had been meaning to read it for the longest time. I teach a course on war and its effects in literature, and I do a World War I unit.
Is it Paul Fussell?
Paul Fussell, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
It is excellent.
It's excellent.
Yeah, and the general argument is that World War I is what helped to create the so-called modern world, right? And this modern form of warfare and how it transformed consciousness. But he also establishes a lot of parallels between the experiences of soldiers in World War I and the literature of the time, right? Fantastic stuff.
Okay.
Highly recommend.
Erasure. It's what?
It's a classic.
Yeah. Erasure, not the band.
Percival Everett, amazing.
Okay.
The film American Fiction was inspired by it, based on it. American Fiction is a gentler take on what's a pretty savage satire, and the book is a little bleaker, but equally hard-hitting as a satire. It's about a black kind of academic writer, right, who is published and established, but he's always sort of accused of not being black enough in his work. Right?
Oh.
And then there's a work that gets national attention called We Lives in the Ghetto, which carts out like the most sort of offensive, caricatured tropes about black people. It becomes a national success. He is like outraged. And so he writes this book himself, right? Which he ends up calling Fuck. And it's the book within the book, which takes it to an extreme, right? About
that sounds great.
Ghetto and all these sort of disgusting tropes, and he sends it off to his publisher, under a pseudonym, and then to his horror, the book starts getting acclaim, right? And it takes on a life of his own. So this book he wrote in disgust with American publishing, and championing this racist, stereotypical views of black people. He writes something even more grotesque that takes on a life of his own, right?
Erasure of Identity reminds me of the 2 fiction books that we focused on, and the Ellison book, Invisible Man.
Percival Everett, another one I need to read. He wrote James this last year. I don't know if you read about that, but it is Huckleberry Finn from the perspective of Jim.
Wow, no.
And which won a lot of accolades and so on. He's been writing for a long time. I think Erasure is from 2003 or something like that. I read a few of his books.
Mm-hmm.
And James is definitely one that is on my list.
Mm-hmm. Have you read Mark Will's Earnest Games? That's a good one.
I have read.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Well, you've sent me all those stories before you even published the book. So I have the book. I was like, yeah, I think I've read just about all of those.
Well, not
already,
all of them,
right?
but okay.
Most of them. I need to go back. I still need to read Pilgrimaging. Is that what it's called?
Pilgrimizing.
So,
yeah.
like I said, I'm going to read that anon. So,
someone else in the chat says reminds me of Spike Lee's Bamboozled. I guess.
Yeah, it does.
Talking
it is
about
a bit
Erasure.
like Bamboozled. Yeah, and it kind of operates on that same kind of gritty level of rage, really. Because the narrator, writer, protagonist is inspired, and you also learn a lot about his family. It's also a family saga, and tragedies are happening there, and so he writes this book within the book, which we then read. And it is inspired by just rage.
I've got a comment on that from Idiotville. Books within books. I've never read one of those where I wanted the book within to continue interrupting the book. Would love your thoughts on that. Well, I'm actually working on a novel that includes a book within a book. So,
okay.
Well, you know about Goat Songs.
Well, I remember Goat Songs was initially a collection of provocative prose poems.
Yeah, but now it's been incorporated into a novel, rather like Nabokov's Pale Fire. So maybe I look
forward to that because I have no idea what. Do you keep some of the prose poems in some way?
all of them. That is the book within the book, right? But there's an introduction by an editor, and then that editor's commentary. So it's like the Kinbotian aspect. Charles Kinbote is the editor of Pale Fire.
Yeah, I still haven't read Pale Fire, which I want to.
Yeah, maybe I'm being too meta and clever for my own good, but
we'll see.
I've already committed to that. So, all right, and then finally,
to answer Steve's question in terms of the book within the book, the nice thing about Erasure is that the book within the book is it's a novella at most, so it's 80, 90 pages in short staccato like chapters.
Yeah.
That in ghetto, and it is, you'll laugh your ass off out loud, right?
That sounds really good.
It is just, oh my God, the audacity of this. And then to discover after that little book within the book that this thing takes a life on his own. And so what the fuck? People, I write this trash as a cathartic rage, and now this is taking off and being accoladed by the literary establishment.
Yeah, of course.
It's both grim and hilarious.
All right, and finally we've got Vonnegut's Mother Night, which you alluded to before. I've been meaning to read that for a while. Did you give it the thumbs up?
Quick. Okay. You can read it and the thumbs up. Yeah, I mean it's not great, but it's good, and it's I hadn't read Vonnegut probably in 30 years. He's one of those authors, whatever, in teenage years when I started reading, and maybe that's when you started reading too, right? You're drawn to certain writers, or at least young men are, right? Vonnegut was, for me, I tore through half a dozen of his books or more at that age, and then got into the Hermann Hesse phase. He was my favorite. Momentarily, unfortunately, outgrew this, right? Ayn Rand, right, with her 2 big books.
Oh my, yeah.
Discovered, to my credit, thankfully, just a couple years out of that, how absolute shit they are, right? But so yeah, Vonnegut, that was one of the ones that sounded interesting to me, about a double agent, right?
Yeah.
Someone who is an American Nazi propagandist, but who apparently is being, has a secret identity as an American spy. So it works pretty well. There are some hilarious passages when he winds up like in New York City after the war, and some neo-Nazis and right-wing folks find out he's their hero, and they all go to sort of see him, and the depiction of some of these right-wing neo-Nazi folks is hilarious. I mean, it's funny, right? So it's good. I want to see the movie with Nick Nolte, which I understand.
Yes.
I haven't seen it, but yeah, I mean, if you want, you've read some Vonnegut, I take it at some point, right?
Well, of course, yeah.
Yeah. So if you haven't in a while, it's good. I'd be willing to talk about it some more if you're, if you read and want to do something more with it. But okay, I'd recommend it.
All right. Well, that's all that I have on my list. Maybe next time we can talk about the sequel to
Stella Maris.
The
Yeah.
Passenger,
Well,
Stella
certainly those.
Maris.
I guess I read we did one on the Passenger, right? And
Yeah.
that I think I read that at the end of the previous year. But
Yes.
Stella Maris, I either finished. I don't remember if that was on this year, but that's
Yeah,
certainly
it
one.
was. It was.
I mean, both of those books are some highlights of the last few years for sure.
Mm-hmm. Can't go wrong with McCarthy. We still
Cannot
need
be.
to read the Border trilogy, but maybe we can talk about
Yeah, we do. I
Stella
feel like it's a
Maris
gap in
first.
mine, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us and sharing
Yeah.
your insights. You've given us a lot of good recommendations.
Thank you for your time. And look, we did pretty well. 1 hour and 20 minutes. That's not bad.
Yeah, I know I got to keep it moving when GJV is in the studio. But yeah, everyone, thanks for tuning into the live stream. I'll put out the edited cooked version soon. Enjoy the raw dog live stream for now. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel and my Substack. That's Mark Will Wright, WRITE.substack.com. Same handle on the YouTube. And yeah, look for the sequel to, oops, not this one, but more product placement here, White Monkey. I can't find it now. But anyway, the Air Nest, there it is. Flannsday, Volume 1. Get your copy now so that you'll be ready for Volume 2, Wild's Day, coming soon. I've been
Coming
saying
soon.
that for over a year, but it'll
You have
happen.
a lot of projects.
It'll happen. Yeah.
Remember, you're highly productive. You got a lot of stuff going on. So.
A lot of irons in the fire, as
That's
they
right.
say.
That's right.
All right. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time on Books Are Burning. Farewell.
All right, cheers.